This is a whole story about what really happened between the Poconokeets and the English. This is the town hall in Warren.
Right.
Okay.
I recognize it.
Most people drive through there if they don't want to go on Metacom, but hardly anybody looks up here. Can you see? I've got an arrow circling in the picture. Can you see that arrow?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. When you look up over the door, you see this, and it says this, Sowams, 1621, and there's a sculpture of the Massasoit, Usamequin. And I lived here for 40 years and never looked up.
Well, hot ticket.
Wow.
And now I look up all the time because what I learned is that Warren was Sowams, Sowams, that's Sowams.
Mm-hmm.
And Sowams is this whole area here. And let's see, over in Tiverton, you're down here.
Yep.
Okay. And when you go across the bridge and go across to Bristol and Warren and Barrington, but also Swansea, Rehoboth, Seacock, East Providence, and all the way up to Providence. This whole area was called Sowams, meaning the southern area. When the Pilgrims arrived, this was already called Sowams, but nobody from the English knew anything about it.
Huh.
Until this guy showed up. Anybody been to Plymouth?
Oh, yeah.
And you, when you go at the top of the hill, you will see a statue by Cyrus Dallin of the Massasoit, Usamequin, right? Okay, he overlooks the harbor there. You can't miss him if you're in Plymouth.
Yep.
And most people think he must be from Plymouth because he met the Pilgrims there in 1621. But guess what?
What?
He didn't live there. He lived here. He lived all the way down in either Warren or Barrington. There's some disagreement about where, but we know for sure he was here. And this is part of the Pokanoket Nation. Okay. How many of you heard of the term Pokanoket? Anybody?
Definitely, yeah.
Oh, good.
I just heard it pronounced differently as Pokanoket.
Yeah, some people say Pokanoket. They say Pokanoket. Okay.
And that's what we'll call them.
All right.
They ought to know who they are. Yep.
And most people have heard this name, Wampanoag, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah.
Yeah, because the Wampanoag will tell you that everybody here was Wampanoag. But we've done our research and nobody heard the name Wampanoag in 1621. It didn't exist. Okay.
Huh.
What they did here was Pokanoket. And this, because this was the territory down here. In fact, all of southeastern Massachusetts and the two islands were all under Massasoit's leadership.
I did not know that.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is a map done by Tom Bicknell about 100 years ago. And
Wow.
it says Pokanoket here. All right.
Right.
Yes.
And then over here you see Sowams. Okay. So
Right.
Sowams was the village, if you will, of the Massasoit, who was Pokanoket and who led over 60 tribes in southeastern Massachusetts.
Wow.
So he was the person that the English had to deal with because he was in charge of everybody living here. Okay.
Yeah.
In
Wow.
fact, the Pokanoket people have lived in this region for over 10,000 years. Anybody have an idea why they didn't live here 15,000 years ago?
Ice Age.
You got it. Right. There's 2 miles of ice here. Nobody lived here. We know that for a fact. Unless you're a very good Eskimo and could live on top of 2 miles of ice, you didn't live here. And so we know that no one lived here until the glaciers receded. Okay. And then after they receded, guess who started visiting here? A whole lot of Europeans. All right.
Yeah.
And they came principally for fishing and trade. And they were active for about an entire century, okay, in the
Mhm.
1500s. You might think, oh, how did they get here? Well, they were pretty good seamen. We know, for instance, that the Vikings were here around the year 1000, okay? So
Yes.
people were quite adept at getting here, but they didn't want to stay here. They came, they fished, they hunted, they got furs, and they left, okay? But in 1621, things began to change. Even though there were over 100,000 people living in New England at the time, okay? Can you imagine 100,000 people living around here who were very happy to trade with the people who came in boats along the shore? They also were happy that nobody wanted to stay here.
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Uh, and unfortunately, one of the ships that came here, we know between 1616 and 1619, they brought communicable diseases from Europe. We don't know precisely what the diseases were. There are lots of theories, but no proof. Whatever, we know that the diseases spread rapidly and resulted in 90% of the population dying along the coast. Now we get upset when we have we're close to almost 1 million people who've gotten COVID, right?
Right. Died of COVID.
Died of COVID, right? And that 1 million is out of 330 million people, like 0.03% of the population. Not that many people when you think of it, okay? Here, 90%, okay? Imagine if 90% of the people along the Atlantic coast were to die next year from the next variant, okay? We don't want to think about that, right?
Right.
But that's what happened there, okay? Wiped out entire villages. Nothing but people, no one could even bury them. They were just left to rot on the ground. So when the Pilgrims arrived in December of 1620, remember they first came out to Cape Cod and then they moved into a place in what we call Plymouth that the native people called Patuxet. There was nobody alive there, but the area was clear. So the English knew that this was a good place to settle. They could raise crops there. This is what they were looking for. So they stayed there through the winter. Half of them died. Okay, out of the 102 who came, half of them died. But by March of the following year, 1621, the Poconokeets, who were living all around the area, not right in Plymouth, were keeping an eye on them. And what they realized was that this was not a trading group because they brought women and children. These were people who planned to stay here. That's the first time that ever happened in New England. Okay. And I won't go into the whole history of the separatists in England and how they went to Leiden and in Holland and then came over here. You all know that story. But when they got here, the Poconokeets kept an eye on them because they feared that these people might be bringing even more disease. So they kept their distance. And not until March 22nd, we're almost at March 22nd, a week from tomorrow. What's March 22nd?
I don't know.
Well, because we don't keep track of what's going on in the natural world, do we? We keep our calendars because of the civilized world. But in the natural world, March 22nd is the spring equinox.
Oh, wow.
Okay.
Yep.
It's 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness. Well, the native people, the Poconokeets, they kept a great deal of information about the celestial movements of the stars and the sun and one thing or another. And so the equinox on March 22nd was essentially a holy day, if you will, a day of spiritual importance. And that's the day the Massasoit chose to come and meet with the pilgrims. Okay.
Mhm.
It wasn't just a random day. This was planned. All right.
I didn't
And
know that.
it was planned for spiritual reasons. All right.
Wow.
So the Massasoit came and they sent Samoset. You know about him. He learned a little bit of English, trading with the French and English traders along the coast. He knew enough to walk into the village and say, "Hello, Englishmen." Remember that?
Oh,
So at least they knew they could talk with somebody, and they were shocked. They had no idea who this guy was and why he was there. But he had been sent by the Massasoit to set up a meeting, and they had a meeting and sat down together and worked out a treaty. Now, treaties are important because they're agreements that help protect both sides. And this treaty was set up specifically so that the English would not have to fear the Poconokeets there. They wouldn't be attacked by them. They could have easily been attacked and sent back to England. And the Poconokeets were very interested in being protected by the English, who had guns, because the Pokanoket in the Great Dying of 1616, 1619 had lost so many of their warriors. They were now vulnerable to being taken over by the Narragansetts. We know where the Narragansetts were. They're on the other side of Narragansett Bay. But they were very interested in moving into Pokanoket land because they knew it was a great place to live. Wonderful hunting, fishing, water, a mild climate, the perfect place, okay? And they had made some efforts to move in, but when they heard that the Massasoit had struck a treaty with the English, and the English had their guns, and every native person was afraid of those guns the first time they heard them fired, they knew that they should stay away. So that treaty was the very first treaty ever struck between a European power and an indigenous power in New England, okay? It was critical for the survival of the English. Had that treaty not been enforced for 40 years, they never would have survived. Had that treaty not been enforced, the Narragansett would have moved in and taken over the area, okay? That was a pivotal time in history here. I don't know if you've ever collected coins, but the only time the U.S. government has ever recognized this is the back of the Sacagawea dollar coin. You can get these coins. I think they cost about $1.35 from a coin collector, and they're currency. You can spend them, okay? But the back of the coin says Wampanoag Treaty 1621. There's only one problem. That name Wampanoag didn't exist in 1621. So U.S. government got it wrong.
Got it wrong completely.
Yeah, we are not surprised. So when the English managed to survive there in Patuxent and realized that they were able to communicate with the native people here, they began to form some friendships. And probably the most important person in making friends with the Massasoit and his tribe was Edward Winslow. Anybody related to him? No? Okay. There are many of Winslow's descendants around. And the governor, Carver, said after the treaty was signed on April Fool's Day, you should go visit Osamequin, the Massasoit, in his home. So in July of 1621, Ed Winslow and a guy named Hampton, I'm sorry, I'll think of his name in a minute, walked 42 miles from Plymouth to Warren, okay? and took him 2 days, and he finally got here and met with him and had a good meeting with him. Traded some goods. Winslow gave Osamequin a red horseman's coat and a copper chain necklace, so that whenever the Massasoit wanted to communicate with people in Plymouth, they would send the necklace with a runner so that the Pilgrims would know that the message was from the Massasoit and not an imposter. A little bit of early espionage back then. So there, we are clear that the village of Sowams, where the Massasoit lived, was here in Warren. Virginia Baker and Guy Fessenden wrote about that in 1855. Then in 1898, Tom Bicknell from Barrington argued that no, that the Massasoit must have been living in Barrington, right? Well, if you live in Barrington, you believe that. If you live in Warren, you believe the other. It doesn't really matter. Okay, there was no question that the Massasoit lived here. Okay, and this is where where Winslow visited. In fact, Winslow came back again 2 years later. Probably visited him several times, but we know for sure because he wrote about it in a book that was published in London in 1624 called Good News from New England. In 1623, when Winslow learned that the Massasoit was ill, he and John Hampden traveled down here again and administered a cure. We think probably some jelly and one thing and another. He wanted to give him chicken soup, but they didn't have a chicken, so they sent for that. But after a few hours of this treatment, the Massasoit recovered. He was on death's door. He was blind. He couldn't hold any food down, and he recovers miraculously from. Some people think that it may actually have been poisoning from botulism, from food that the Dutch gave him because there was a Dutch trading ship in the Warren River just before this visit. So who knows?
Oh my God.
Yeah.
That's sabotage.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
So
My God.
here's Winslow curing the Massasoit, and the Massasoit was so grateful. He said, "Keen Winslow, we will be friends for life."
Wow.
He meant it.
Mm.
We're friends until he died 40 years later in 1661. And he maintained the treaty. That is so critical to this whole time period, okay? So
Wow.
if you ever wonder what the area here in Warren might have looked like then, when I started on this project, I thought, oh, there must have been 6-foot round oak trees everywhere and huge forests and all that kind of stuff. Well, that's not the case. The Pokanoket people were very good farmers, raised a lot of corn, and they would clear the area by burning the fields in spring and fall. So they had these huge open areas there, and they were able to maintain their village in their Wetus and not have to move as much as they once did. So that by the time the Pilgrims got here, they looked at that land and they thought, oh boy, here's Miles Standish, one of the Pilgrims. He was kind of their general. And he came over here and called this the Garden of the Patent. The patent is what you get from the king to have land here. And the flower, although he spelled it Flour, of the garden, because it was perfect land. This is when the English came over, you got to remember that in England, nobody could get land. It was all tied up. The peasant people had to rent land, and they were poor. Here was a chance to own their own land, and here was cleared land. This was a gold mine, okay, far better than gold for the English. So even Standish bought some land here. All right. He didn't live here, but this was the place to live.
Wow.
Well, not too long after that, 16 years later, how many people have heard of Roger Williams? No?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, you should know about Roger because he changed a lot of things around here. Well, when Roger came, he came over, there was a huge movement of English people in 1630. He decided that he didn't like what was going on in England. There was no freedom of religion. So he came over here. And he first came to Plymouth. Why not? Because that's where the English were at first. And while in Plymouth, he got to know Usamequin because they were dealing with the tribe all the time there. And he learned how to speak Algonquin so he could talk with Usamequin. Well, it wasn't too long, about 2 years, and Plymouth people had it with Roger's radical ideas about religion. Okay, so they sent him packing, and he went up to Salem, spent another year and a half there. There's a picture of his house up in Salem, he again began to say the church should not be the ones in charge of government. Government and church should be two different entities. Well, you can imagine how that set with the people in Boston. They didn't like that idea. So they sent the troops up in January of 1636 to Roger's house, and they were going to take him by force back to England, get rid of him, all right? Roger got word of that, left in January, one of the worst, coldest Januaries of the time. The Narragansett Bay had frozen over. It was that cold. There are 3 feet of snow. He walks over 60 miles, okay, from Salem down to meet with Usamequin here in Warren, all right, because they were friends, and he figured Usamequin would help him. Well, Usamequin's warriors found him on the trail. He was suffering from exposure, really on death's doorstep. So Usamequin took him in and sheltered him at this rock, or what was, we call it a cave, but if you can imagine putting logs up at this one end of this large rock and building a fire down in here, you could make a shelter out of that. This is known as Margaret's Cave. It was named for Margaret. It's probably an Algonquin name that the English couldn't pronounce, so they said Margaret, but who knows what it really was. But we know that from Roger's own account that he spent 14 weeks recovering here, all right?
Wow.
And then we figured that Roger wasn't put out in the woods by Usamequin by himself. That's not what you do with a friend. This was where the winter settlement was for the Poconokas. They would move inland in the wintertime to get away from the cold and the winds, and when they couldn't fish. So we found the cave. The Roger Williams Family Association has placed a marker there. And this is not far from where I live in Warren, just over the Swansea line. And we take groups there. It's on private property, but we introduce people to the story of Roger Williams, because if he had not survived that winter and had died, guess what would have happened or wouldn't have happened?
There would be no Rhode Island.
There would be no Rhode Island, no Providence, no freedom of religion in America. Okay, this is a critical point in time, and something that people need to know about. Unfortunately, Roger had to leave, and Usamequin sent him up to what is today Omega Pond in East Providence. I don't know if anybody's ever been to East Providence, but if you go up there, there's this monument way in the back there, and it's the Roger Williams Spring, and we believe that's where he first settled. He planted his crops, brought his family down from Salem and thought he could live there, but then Ed Winslow from Plymouth came over and said, "Sorry, you're on our land. You can't stay here. You got to leave."
Wow.
Yeah.
I didn't know that.
Oh, it was awful. And this is in June. He had been there since April, and his crops are just beginning to grow. And now you have to leave. Terrible. But leave he did. And there are a couple of houses from the 17th century right nearby there.
Wow.
So Roger ends up going across the river in Seekonk and settles in this area down in the lower left picture. That is what we think Providence must have looked like at the time. This great salt pond here is where the Providence water fire takes place today. It's all obviously, and this hill up here is the hill where the State House is. And then way in the back, this hill in the back is Newtoconnecut Hill, if you know, that's on the western boundary of Providence. Anyway, this is an artist's conception of what Rogers Village must have looked like. If you want to know more about it, go to the Roger Williams National Memorial right downtown in Providence, and there's go over to the interpretation place, and you can learn all about them. And you can stop to see the Weybosset Bridge, which is at the bottom of College Street, right in downtown Warren. That bridge is the 8th version of the same bridge that Roger Williams used to be the toll taker for, because that was the bridge that you would use to get across from the West Bay to the East Bay. Okay, so
Oh my God.
Unfortunately, there aren't any buildings that survived from the 17th century there, but we know where the bridge was.
David, I'm just going to interject.
Yep.
Our friend John McNiff, who's the park ranger and a 17th century reenactor, I think has arranged again for Roger Williams documents to come from the Rhode Island Historical Society. And I think once a month they bring, on a Thursday, they bring a document down so you can go and see his actual writing. And
Right.
so I think they're doing that again. So, and there's the church I belong to.
Oh, there you go. Well, I know John well, and he brought those documents over to Roger Williams University a couple of years ago.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
had students look at them and try to read Old English.
I remember that workshop.
Yes, right. You were there?
I was there.
Oh,
Yeah.
good. Okay.
He's
Well,
so amazing.
It wasn't long after Roger that a group from Weymouth decided that they too would move down here, and they purchased an 8-by-8 mile of land that they named Rehoboth, and this is the Samuel Newman Church. This is not the original church, obviously. This is the 4th church building. But they, as you see, they gathered in 1643. Okay, not too long after Roger was across the river, and you could still see some of the grave markers from people, the Carpenter family in particular, who lived there.
Wow.
So the area was starting to get populated with more English people at the time, and around the Newman Church they established what they called the Ring of the Green. If you look here around the Newman Church, this red area was a large common area where people would put their animals to stay at night so that they could be protected from wolves and other predators. All right. And you would pay somebody to stay up all night to protect them. But then each of the house lots radiated out from the green. And you'll notice that they radiate out to either the Seekonk River on the left or the 10-Mile River, which wraps right around here. This is the 10-Mile River. So that everybody had, isn't this a great deal? You had a gate and access to the green for your animals. You could put your house here. You have a woodlot. And then at the back of your woodlot, you had access to water for transportation or fishing or whatever. Okay. What a deal. I mean,
I don't think it could get any more perfect than that
no, this is the real estate deal of the century.
of the century. Yep.
Right. And it lasted until the King Philip War. So from 43 to 75. So it was a good deal, and lots of people moved in here. And that was the start of what we know as East Providence today, but was then first Rehoboth, and then it got split to Seekonk. So that house I showed you a while ago was actually in 2 states and 3 cities without having to move.
You know, David, an interesting thing about Newman Church is that it's incorporated in Rhode Island, but because it was founded before the separation of
Right.
Massachusetts and Rhode Island, its actual legal body is in Massachusetts.
That's right.
So it has both
Both of those designations.
both of those designations. Yeah.
And it's a very active and vibrant church. And
Yes,
I'm working with them on putting a historic marker across the street so people know more what happened there.
oh, that's fabulous. That's great.
So if you go into Rehoboth today, you'll find some evidence of the 17th century. No buildings. All the buildings were burned during the King Philip War, but they have some signs around town about these block houses were what's called Garrison Houses. People were concerned about native uprising, particularly after 1671. So they built fortifications in case what actually did happen, and it protected a lot of people. They lost their own houses, but they were not killed in the war. Well, this is what was going on then. Here's a map of this whole area. Over here is Swansea. Down here is Bristol, and over here is Barrington. And if you look at these yellow places, okay, around the map, okay, all over the place, these were English settlements, and all the way down to Newport, okay. And the red areas were the original native settlements, but they ended up, for the most part, leaving this area because they sold this whole land that was Swansea in 1653. So the Poconokeets were pretty much restricted to the Bristol Peninsula, and their numbers were diminishing. We estimate that in 1620 there were at least 7,000 Poconokeets in this area. By 1675, they were down to 700. Okay, so they were decimated, largely by illness. There was a big outbreak of smallpox in 1632. Just the stress of colonization and the fact that the English were everywhere. They were letting their animals wander into native cornfields, and things were not going well. Okay, and they were treated more and more unjustly. And meanwhile, the English population was exploding. We started with 102 people in Plymouth, and by 1675, there were 50,000 people living around here. 50,000. Okay.
Dave?
Yep.
I have a question about Swayze up here.
Swansea.
Well, yeah, Swansea is a Welsh name,
Yes,
not an English one. So were there Welsh settlers
absolutely. Yes.
here as well? Okay.
Yeah, you remember the Newman Church back up here?
Yep.
They had a group that broke off from them, and they hired a pastor from Wales, from Swansea, and brought him over to John Miles. Have you ever heard of Miles? Okay, he was the pastor that they recruited and brought to. They had you could actually see a marker for where the church was in 1663. It's now in Barrington, but that was Swansea at the time. There was a little settlement there. That's where the King Philip War broke out, right there at the Miles Church. That was the Second Baptist Church in America was there. Miles was a significant figure in the war. He had a house nearby that's called the Miles Garrison, and I'll show you a picture of where that was at one point. So you're right. It's the Welsh influence that kind of changed a little bit of the history in this area. So by 1675, the Pokanokets were reduced in numbers, of seeing their land disappear, seeing their culture disappear, and really feared for their very existence. They thought another 20 years and they'll be gone. And as we see now in Ukraine, right? What's going on there? You've got an indigenous population who's being invaded, and what are they doing?
Fleeing for their very lives.
Well, they're fleeing, but they're also fighting back.
Right.
Okay.
Well, the women are taking the children away, and the
Right.
men are sticking it out.
That's right. And in the same way, the Pokanokets saw their numbers diminishing, and they said, if we don't do something, we're done for. So a war broke out. Okay, it started in Warren and spread all the way up to Northampton. I think I've got a map here. You can see the course of the war here. It was the bloodiest war in North America per capita. Over 600 English people were killed and over 3,000 Native people. Okay, and it only lasted 14 months. And at one point, by early spring of 1676, it looked like the Native people were winning. They had joined up with other tribes, and their effort was really to push the English back away, back to Boston. They simply wanted them out of here. Okay. And they might have succeeded. It was close. But they began in the spring. They began running out of food and ammunition, and they hoped to get help from the Mohawks, but that didn't work out. And the next thing you know, Benjamin Church, if you heard of him from Sonnet, he started fighting the natives the way they fought. They didn't line up in among their troops and shoot on command. They did guerrilla warfare. Well, Church allied with a number of friendly natives and went after Philip and captured him in this picture down in the lower left at Mount Hope in Bristol. He came back to his home, and they found him there, and he was shot dead, not by Church, his gun misfired, but a native man named Alderman actually killed Philip. Philip had killed his brother earlier, so there was a little revenge going on. That essentially ended the war. I mean, there was capture of Anawan, and there was some warfare that went on all the way up in Maine for a couple of years. But once Philip was gone, the English had the upper hand, and it wasn't long before what they did was, as we see in warfare all over that time, and quite frankly today, it hasn't changed. When you win a war, what do you do with your enemy?
Put its head up on the stockade so you can prove to,
You chop his head off and post it as a warning, and you either kill or enslave the men, mostly it's the women, and you send them to Barbados where they're enslaved. You get rid of them, okay? And that's essentially what happened to the Pokanokets. Some survived by moving over to Connecticut, being absorbed into other tribes, never identifying themselves as Pokanoket. you could be
Mm.
shot on sight if you spoke the language or called yourself Pokanoket. So you can understand why the tribe for many years disappeared. Okay,
Right.
you don't hear about them, and then this name Wampanoag, which is really the name of the forces that Philip brought together. But anyway, that's what the people in Mashpee didn't. The Mashpee did not fight with against the English. They were allies with the English, and they were out here on the Cape. They remained neutral, but they ended up adopting the name Wampanoag, and that's why you hear Wampanoag everywhere, as if they're the only tribe that was ever here. That is simply not true.
Dave, do you know, for instance, were Weedamo and other members of the Pecasset and Sacagawea, were they too captured?
Yes.
They were. Okay.
Yeah, Weedamo, remember, she was married to King Philip's brother Wamsutta. So they were allied, and Weedamo was very successful in moving, in particular, women and children over into Narragansett land for protection. And if you read a book by Lisa Brooks called Our Beloved Kin, she's an Abenaki woman who wrote about the King Philip War from the perspective of the native people. And she tells the whole story about how Weedamo protected the women. She knew where the food supplies were. Unfortunately, she ends up being killed in the war as well. And you know, it was a great tragedy. The Sacagawea people essentially were wiped out. There are no more Sacagawea today. But there are Pecasset tribe members, and the Pecasset tribe is alive and well.
Yeah, they have a great Facebook.
Yes, right.
Yeah, really do.
And they were awarded with some reservation land over east of the North Watuppa Pond and Fall River.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
wow.
So
that's amazing.
Back here in Swansea today, if you go, you could see the site. This Garrison House over here in Swansea. That's not the original garrison that was there in 1675, but it's a house that was built on top of it, and that's since burned. But anyway, there's a marker placed there over 100 years ago that talks about the Miles Garrison. Miles, again, was the Welsh pastor, and he lived in the house that people left the meeting house on that day in June 20th in 1675 when they were first attacked. And yeah, managed to survive there. That's an amazing story, and I don't have time to go into all the detail. The place where Philip was slain is on Mount Hope land. If you go to Mount Hope Farm, you're familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah, you could walk there and see the monument there. It's back up in the woods, but so we know where Philip was killed and quartered and beheaded and all that. And then up in Rehoboth, you can go visit Anawan Rock, and that's where King Philip's Major General Anawan was finally cornered and captured there a few weeks after Philip's death, and that ended it. That was it. Church captured him, and of course, even though they stayed up all night telling war stories, church sent him to Plymouth, and then they killed him. You know, so usual story, huh? So today, you know, people say, "Well, where are the Pokanoket? How do we know they were here? What, you know?" Well, they didn't build monuments. They didn't build pyramids. Okay, they didn't put up an Eiffel Tower. They you know, they didn't build things. Their whole culture was based on movement and, you know, temporary spaces and going from one place to the other. So you have to know where to look to find them. And here are a few places, and if you go on the website, you'll find all of them, and
Oh, wow.
maps and descriptions and all that. But there's the top two in the pictures here. On the left is a ceremonial rock that was rolled on top of a rock outcropping that was used to locate the stars at night. Okay, and on the right is a large rock that if you go up on top of it, there's a groove in the middle where Native women used to grind corn by rolling a rock down, things of that sort.
Oh my gosh.
And then the ones on the bottom on the left is Abrams Rock behind Town Hall in Swansea. In the middle is the seat in Bristol at the Mount Hope Farm, at the lands there, Mount Hope lands. Brown University won't let you go there right now. And then over in Newtaconicut Hill was a place where Native tribes used to meet to have council among the 4 tribes here. So there are places here. I tell people, before the Acropolis had not the Colosseum, but the temple on top of the Acropolis, it was just a big rock outcropping. Okay.
Right.
So these are their acropoli, all right? And you have to know where to find them.
Dave, I was lucky enough to get into C. King Philip's chair this past early November.
Oh, good.
And it's you first look at it and you say, I don't see it. And then I was with somebody who knows it well, and you can imagine. I find it interesting that this is that he would sit at the lower tier,
Right in here.
and then all of the leaders would stand above him. Right. That's right. And so you begin to get this picture of what that looked like, and it's amazing.
Well, it's very typical of Pokanoket culture to find natural rock outcroppings and then to use those as ceremonial places. That's how they did things. And the good thing about that is that those rocks are still here. Okay.
Right.
Right.
That's right. Yeah, the English couldn't do much to those, could they?
No, thank goodness.
Yeah.
So on the English side, if you want to look for the oldest places around, if you are in Bristol, just go across the Mount Hope Bridge and go through downtown Bristol. And just as you're leaving the downtown area, where Sip and Dip is there along.
Yeah.
Look across the street. There's a little park there, and then you'll see this house.
Yeah.
And you'll say, "Oh, what's that?" Yeah, well, it's not restored, but it is the very first house ever built in Bristol.
Isn't that so?
1680. Okay.
Wow.
There's a little sign on the corner over here, and I thought it was a joke, but it turns out it's privately owned. The guy's turned it into apartments. Fortunately, he hasn't wrecked the place. And someday somebody's going to buy the place and restore it. But if you look back down in the lower left, it was called Silver Creek.
Isn't that something?
A lovely place. That was the parsonage that they built for the pastor Bosworth that they brought over from England. Remember, you couldn't have a town without a meeting house. You couldn't have a meeting house without a church. You couldn't have a church without a pastor. You couldn't have a pastor without a parsonage. So the first thing you do is you build a parsonage. Then you get a pastor. Then you get a church. Okay. And this is what they think the meeting house looked like.
Look what the meeting house looked like down, and it was next to the house parsonage.
No, it's actually on the town common where the old State House sits now.
Oh, no kidding. Okay.
Down there.
All right.
This is somebody's imagination. Nobody knows. There was no contemporary drawing of it. It's typical of meeting houses, square buildings and things of that sort. But
Mhm.
that would have been about 1683 or so, somewhere along there.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah.
and then if you go, I now have a historic marker in front of the church on High Street, the Congregational Church there. So do stop by there sometime and take a look at it. And we've got pictures of this is the one of the pews from that church. This is an original pew from 1683. Okay, and some of the documents. They have a little museum in there. They have a whole communion set there in silver, and some of the original pastors. They're not buried next to the church, but that's where they put the markers. Everybody in Bristol from that time was buried in the town common.
Mm.
And you go over to the town common and all you see is playground equipment. And then you go across the street and you see this really strange burial ground because all the headstones are a little too close together. And you think, you can't bury anybody there. It's nothing but bedrock there. Well,
I've wondered about that, Dave. I've looked in there and said, wait a second.
right. Well, it's both the headstones and the footstones, but they're way too close together. And they left the bodies in the common.
Oh, wow.
Okay, they just moved the headstones. So,
Is that thing?
so
Yeah, I've looked at that. It's what the North burial, right? And it's
Yep.
just odd. It's like,
it is an odd place to put a burial ground, right? But it meant that they can use the common,
right.
they do,
Wow.
So
That's
when you get over there, take a look at that.
uh,
And there are a couple of houses from the 17th century. You may remember, may have driven by the Reynolds house on that's on Hope Street there.
Yeah.
The 3-story house. Lafayette stayed there. Okay, but it was from 1698, and then a portion, this little portion back here of Elm Farm, was from 1695.
isn't that something?
Yeah, there are only 3 pre-1700 houses in Bristol. And there are only a dozen 17th century houses in any of these 8 towns.
Wow.
And here are some of them. There's the John Martin House in Barrington. If you're up on Market Street in Warren, heading up to Swansea, you'll go by the Hale Noon's farmhouse there. Over on Route 6 in Swansea is the John Martin House. It says 1728, but we think the foundation was prior to 1700. And then in Seacock, the William Hunt House, privately owned, and the Kingsley House, also privately owned in Rehoboth. That's pretty much it. There's because so many of the houses were burned during the King Philip War, nothing much survived. Nothing from Providence.
Nothing. Right.
No.
Everything was gone. Right.
Right. So here we are, back again in Warren. Okay, you're at the end of the trip, and this is the 4 years ago. That excavation was to rebury the Massasoit, whose remains were dug up in 1913 by the town librarian Charles Carr, who was an amateur archaeologist, and he saw the railroad that went through. That's now the bike path there. He thought they're just going to dig all those up and people will take them home or throw them away or whatever. So he decided that the best thing to do was for him to dig them up. And then he sent the grave contents to various museums. Well, in 1990, the federal government passed the American Indian Grave Reclamation Act, which required that any tribe could reclaim anything that came from an Indian burial site. It's like, imagine if you went to your grandmother's or grandfather's burial and you found somebody had dug it up and taken things home with them. You wouldn't be very happy. Well, it's the same thing, okay? So a group from Mashpee came over here 4 years ago, dug a place, the town let them put a vault in, this concrete vault, and they put all the remains that they had recovered from the various museums in that vault, covered it over, put this monument on top, and then held a celebration there. So it was a very significant event. It meant that the Massasoit Usamiquan was finally home again.
Oh,
Okay? And
isn't that so?
that's what started me on this whole thing.
Wow, Dave, that's what a journey. And you know, so on the rock, I see it's very poignant. You know, they say this Wampanoag, Massasoit, Osamian, how is
Well,
Osamai
Usamiquan.
is okay. And because I hadn't heard that name applied before, so that's really interesting. But a steam leader of the Wampanoag Nation, his vision in 1621 treaty of upheld 54 years of peace with early settlers. That's really beautiful. Yeah.
Well,
I love how it's shaped like an arrowhead, though.
Mhm.
yeah. Yeah, they did a lot of work, and the Pokanokets are not happy because it says Wampanoag, but
Yeah.
Oh,
other than that, it's a fitting memorial to. Um, I rank Osamigan up there with George Washington and Napoleon, and name a bunch of world leaders. Okay,
Yeah.
I mean these are people who transformed history, and if Osamiquan had not struck that treaty and kept to it for 54 years, we wouldn't be here. Okay, we might be Algonquin or we might be French, who knows? But we wouldn't be English because the English would have been sent packing. Okay,
Mhm.
so
So does Osamiquan mean yellow feather
yes, it's actually,
in
if you
English?
spell it correctly, it's USA, O-U-S-A, and then new word Miquin, M-E-Q-U-I-N,
Okay.
yellow feather, right?
USA.
There are about 10 different spellings of his name. And remember, this is English spelling of Algonquin, and who knows what his original name sounded like. You know, these are
Mhm.
approximations.
Mhm.
wow. Dave, that's fantastic. Can you say something about the process of establishing these communities as a national historic site? How is that coming along?
Well, slowly. Um,
Yeah.
you know, maybe you've heard of the Blackstone Valley Heritage Area. Has
Yeah.
anybody heard
Yeah.
of that? Okay, that was the second heritage area established in the country 30 years ago. There have since been 54 other sites all across the country.
Mhm.
And frankly, until I started on this project, I never knew a thing about them. The National Park Service has designated certain areas as having historic significance, but they don't rise to the level of a Grand Canyon or Niagara Falls or something of that sort. They're more collections of smaller historic areas, okay?
Mhm.
And they have a common theme. Um, there's one in eastern Connecticut called the Last Green Valley. I never heard anything about it, but it's all about things that happen in eastern Connecticut. So
Mhm.
if you drive through there and you see a sign that says Last Green Valley, you stop and you learn about all the other things that happened there. So
Mhm.
it's a way of telling the story.
Mhm.
We want to do the same thing here in the East Bay.
Right.
I'm sorry it won't include Tiverton because you're a Pocasset tribe and not Pokanoket.
Mhm.
The Pokanoket area was from Bristol on up to Providence and included Swansea, Rehoboth, and
Mhm.
Seacock. So it's a small area, but um, it has a single story about the Pokanoket people and what happened to them here.
Yeah.
And that's the story we want to tell. So I'm in the process of, we had a meeting this morning with a potential consultant who will help us work on this. It's a long application process, as you can well imagine.
Yeah.
We have to get a lot of people involved. We will need to get congressional funding, you know, so I've got my work cut out for me.
And then
Well,
when you
I heard
then you
American history described as the stories written by the winners of the war,
Right,
the wars in plural,
right.
in their own language and with their own point of view. Yeah.
That's around the world.
Yep.
Um, what's I don't think I could do this project 20 years ago. Now people are much more aware and sensitized to the fact that maybe things weren't the way we were told they were. And now if you go to Plymouth, you will hear the Wampanoags tell a whole different story. The Plymouth, the 400th anniversary of the landing in Plymouth, a third of that story is told by the Wampanoag people.
Good.
So, yeah, we're getting there. We've got a long way to go.
A long way to go.
Yeah. And
My college roommate was a history major, and she took her junior year from college abroad and was at one of the colleges at Oxford University. And she came home with a story of doing research in American history from the English point of view. And the Bodleian Library was so old in terms of the documents that it had in their archives that early American history was still filed, this is up 50 years ago, still filed under failed colonial experiments.
right. Yeah. We're just an experiment. You're right.
Yep, failed colonial experiments.
Yep.
That's fabulous, Leslie.
Yeah,
That's
well,
great.
it teaches you that
Maybe they've cleaned up their act since then. Reports last October, a dear friend who was also, though a Scotsman, loyal to the bone, was educated also at Oxford, and said, no. By the time I got there, it was filed under American history.
Thank God for the follow-up, you know.
well, history and its interpretation.
Failed colonial
changes and
experiments.
changes
Yep.
and changes, right.
It all depends on your point of view.
You got it. So our effort is to try to reveal a different point of view, and I hope people are ready to hear that story, and I hope that we can do a good job of interpreting that story. There are a lot of barriers to overcome, but if my vision is that in 20 years, people will come to this area and they will learn a whole history that nobody knows anything about today, and we'll have a much more nuanced understanding of what took place 400 years ago. Right.
Thank you so much for your contribution to all of this work. It's very enlightening, fascinating, and important. So,
Dave, I think one of the things that fascinates me is how you, as a white Anglo person, how you have been able to build relationships with the Pokanoket tribe, because this is not easy to do. This is not easy to do at all, and it's a very patient process of building those relationships. How has that been for you?
Well, you're right. It takes a good deal of time, and the issue is one of trust. And when you're working with people who have been who had to deal with so much mistrust throughout their whole history, you can understand why they're cautious about who they deal with, who they talk with. They've been taken advantage of over and over again, and not just by Europeans. They've been taken advantage by other tribes.
Right.
Okay. So it's not easy for them to tell their story. Fortunately, this particular tribe is open to that idea. It has really become much more aware of the fact that if they don't tell their story, then no one will, and they need allies to do that. There's only so much you can do to beat your own drum. You've got to get other people beating their drum too. And so that's what we're trying to do. And I don't know if you know that we were in Warren, just this last July, we were able to get a land acknowledgement passed. Then Barrington turned around and passed one. Now we're working on East Providence. And that's, if you want to do that in Tiverton and work with the Pecasset tribe, that's one step that you can take toward recognition and helping people. Basically, no one should grow up here without knowing who lived here for 10,000 years. I mean, that's crazy for people to think that, this is just unpopulated till 400 years ago. I mean, that's nuts. And the schools really have a responsibility to teach this history, and anything you could do to help enlighten people, because that's the first step. I mean, there's a lot more to go, but if people don't have a basic understanding of what happened here, then how do you do anything?
It's any other David, that's it. That's the rationale for teaching Indigenous history in schools.
Yep.
Anybody else? David, thank you. I'm so glad we have a recording, because we can encourage people to, when you download that, for people to listen to it, especially this discussion. It's been amazing, and I'm so thankful to you. Thanks for doing this.
I find that far more people listen to a recording than attend any event.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. Dave, we will follow up with you. I'm going to make good on
I'll
promise
get back to you
to catch up with you and Sarah.
Yep. Give me a couple days.